Greetings. This is The Filter with Matt Asher. Matt Welch is a journalist, author, and podcaster. He's an editor-at-large at Reason Magazine, the author of a book about libertarian politics and one about the not-so-libertarian John McCain, and he's part of the thoroughly entertaining Fifth Column podcast. Matt, welcome to The Filter.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the nice shout-out to the Fifth Column. A bit drunker, probably, than this podcast is.
Well, who knows? You don't know what state I'm in here this morning, but we'll just roll with it and get going. It is great to have you here, and that is a great podcast. I want to start by asking you something of a meta question. Obviously, 2020 has been, let's just say, interesting. You've covered the events of this year as a journalist and those of many years going back. For this podcast, I'm not so interested in the events per se. I'm more interested in how our perceptions of the world have changed over time. I know this is a big question, but I wonder if you could get us started on it, either by how your own perception of the world has changed over time or how you see our collective perceptions changing.
I mean, one micro way to answer a meta question is, it came up in conversation last night. Someone was talking about the events in Portland, where you have right now every night demonstrators and then rioters going to courthouse buildings. First it was a justice center, and now it's a federal courthouse building. And they kind of attack it, they vandalize it, sometimes they set it on fire. The police largely do nothing, the local police, and then President Trump has sent in federal law enforcement apparatus to come in and kind of crack down, and they're having these pitched battles in Portland. And someone was remarking like, hey, I'm not sure. I think Trump might win in November, if he's running against all the chaos in Portland. And my response has nothing to do with political prognostication necessarily, but with my own kind of filter through which I'm looking and experiencing the world right now, which, while idiosyncratic, shares a lot in common with a lot of people, which is to say, my God, I'm just trying to figure out where my kids are going to go to school in September. And like, that's a little bit more important to me than culture war and even like LARPing war issues are right now. It's a lot more important. There's, we have 144,000 dead bodies from a pandemic. You have widespread unemployment everywhere. People are just boarding up whole swaths of whole towns. The process of lockdowns and quarantines, which people have experienced differently in different places, but most people have experienced some form of it. I was penned in my house with my family of 4 for 3 months, and we all lost our minds. So at some point at Reason, we were talking about our political coverage for the upcoming presidential election. And I've gone to every major party political convention since 2000. Won't be going this year. And this year, I was like, are the Democrats still having one? When is it? Like, you're so dimly aware of the usual stuff. That is how much that the calamity of 2020 weighed down on all of us. I kind of liken it to, especially when the George Floyd protests were first starting and people were just sort of like springing out of their houses. You're probably not old enough to remember this, but in the 70s, when you're growing up on all these stupid kids shows like Zoom or Wonderama, and then in all of the many, many terrible and wonderful game shows, they would have these little cans that you would open. Oh, it's a can of, I don't know, like it's a tennis ball can or something. You'd open it up and then boom, a whole like snake would come out of it. It was a funny snake thing, and it was a big surprise, and everyone would laugh. That we are the snake. We are the canned snake right now. And to think that we are experiencing politics and the world and news and everything like that with anything like a recognizable point of view, given the fantastic amounts of pressures and weirdnesses that we've been under, is folly. People adapt or they change their perspective based on events around them. And this is traumatic, what we've been going through. So I think it colors all of our thinking. And especially in the news business, people are always kind of fighting the last war or trying to experience what happened 4 years ago. And I think that is a mistake. We are not the same people. I am not the same person as I was 4 months ago, let alone 4 years ago. And I think we have to keep that in mind.
you're concluding your thought with the 2020 and just the way it's kind of hammered all of our brains, perhaps would be one way to put it, no?
Yeah. In the old book Watership Down by Richard Adams that we all read growing up in the 70s, there is a wonderful phrase there called Thorn, which is to describe what happens to a rabbit as it is crossing the road and then gets into the headlights of an oncoming 18-wheeler. It freezes in terror. It kind of looks at it and it's unable to move. It's stricken by thorn. A lot of thorn going on out there. It's hard to act normally in a distinctly abnormal set of circumstances. Around me, and I live in Brooklyn, New York. New York was very much the epicenter of the pandemic for a long time. I know probably now a dozen people who have been engaging in the very traumatic and expensive process of moving. They have to change the fundamental aspects of their life as a response to both the pandemic and the policy responses to the pandemic and the economic responses to it. So, those people, are they going to be really caught up in what's happening in Portland, or whether Joe Biden committed a gaffe or, whatever? I'm not so sure.
I think that there's sort of two interesting things that I want to pick up on. One is this idea that your focus narrows when something like this happens and everything else gets shut out. And then the other is that, to some extent, I did a lot of this thinking at the beginning of the pandemic, and I for sure felt deer in the headlights about especially the reaction to it. And what I thought a lot about was whether what needed to happen was my perception of the world needed to come around to the reality of the world, in that there's the saying, right, when the water goes out, you find out who's swimming naked, right? And what happened here was a fairly large crisis hit, and what we found out was that people really like a tyrannical response, or that they have much more tolerance for it than I thought they would. I know that relative to everyone else, we're probably both very far on the libertarian, anarcho-voluntarist, whatever spectrum. But even so, and even knowing that about myself, I was kind of shocked at how quickly people accepted the logic of the lockdowns and the need for them. And it definitely made me reconsider my perception of the world, which was that while I may be on the high end in terms of desiring liberty, that I wasn't completely removed from my fellow human beings in that. But then the lockdowns hit, and I was just shocked at the apparent high level of compliance.
One of the weird aspects to watch in the kind of the discourse and commentary about it is that there's a whole subcategory of opinion columns and commentary there that were criticizing Trump for A, wanting to be a dictator in his response or having an authoritarian response, but also B, for not doing it because they really wish that he would crack down in a certain, so like He's bad because he wants to be a dictator. He's also bad because he's so ineffective that he can't be a dictator, because right now what we need is a dictator. There was quite a bit of that kind of commentary, and like, wow, people's brains are scrambled. My kind of sense of Thorn is less ideological, maybe thinking about my own responses here and more kind of personal. Like, you go through this phase where you don't know what's happening, so you're sort of terrified. Like, how does things transmit? How many people were wiping down their groceries 3 months ago, 2 months ago? I think I had one grocery wipe down day, and then you sort of step back from that, like, oh, okay, hold on. Remember when everyone was washing their hands for 2 minutes every half an hour? Most people are not doing that anymore. Yet now, many more people are wearing masks than they were before. The thing that strikes me is that there's a lot of people who don't show any kind of demonstrated interest in learning as we learn. And the way that I experience this the most is when talking about the idea about reopening elementary schools, which I have skin in the game. I have a 5-year-old who did not have a particularly good spring. And so I read with very strong interest the science and the policy writing having to do with school opening, and also having to do with the transmission of the virus among young kids, who they transmit it to, how they catch it, what's the rate of this stuff. And the science is pretty overwhelming to the extent that we have it. They've reopened schools now in 24 countries. It might be closer to 36 by now since the last time I looked at it. And kids are basically not catching it, and they are basically certainly not transmitting it to teachers. The one possible edge case on that is Israel, which was experiencing a countrywide kind of spike. So we'll have to see how that goes. But anyways, I was in March clamoring for the mayor of New York to close down schools because it was clear that we were having a pandemic surge, and the local response here, generally speaking, was kind of slow and like, we don't want to shut the subway down. We don't want to do this. And I felt like they were taking ideological reasons to be slow to do it. But like, we've learned a lot since then. And now I'm on the other side. And when you argue with people or just have conversations with people, they want to go straight into, why do you want to kill my sister who's an elementary school teacher? It's like, I really don't. The metaphor that I have, and I'm terrible at metaphors, so enjoy this, everyone, I suppose. So imagine that there are two fast-moving rivers side by side. Except they're going in opposite directions. And then imagine there's a strip of land in the middle where those who do not feel comfortable in those rivers and kind of maybe want to take things on a case-by-case basis. So one river, let's call them the kind of anti-Trump progressive, could be Bernieite, could be identitarian, but it's just anti-Trump left. Rivers just going this direction. And on the other side, you have sort of the super Trumpy right. Both sides, incidentally, are not big friends of liberalism broadly defined, and you see a lot of different fights there. What they want to do more than anything else is sweep you along. The banks are eroding. They want to sweep you along because what they are forever trying to do, and they do this during the pandemic, they do this during politics, they do this when they talk about free speech. It happens everywhere, especially on race, but not only, is that they want to sort the world into binary categories. To paraphrase Ibrahim X. Zendi, and I'm sorry for botching his name, there's no such thing as being not racist. You're either anti-racist or you're racist. That is a pure and very kind of rhetorically effective binary. But people are doing that all over the place. On the right, too, they want a simple heroes and villains story because it's relaxing. Imagine all the time that you save when you don't have to worry about the actual complexities of an argument, or that evidence changes over time and you might change your approach toward it. It's like, no, I heard Donald Trump and Betsy DeVos say that they want to reopen schools. Therefore, anyone who wants to reopen a school either is on their team and evil or just wants to kill kids. And you see this kind of sorting happen all of the time. And I think that is kind of, in some senses, the dominant filtering mechanism in the space, in the hyperspace where people are arguing the most about politics. It is not, however, I don't think, the kind of dominant paradigm when you get out of those hyper-political spaces, when you get out of the places where people are watching cable news or spending 10 hours a day on Twitter. Most Americans do neither of those activities and find a lot of the kind of cultural and discourse habits among those people to be alien and off-putting. But those banks are eroding, and you're seeing this kind of binary thinking invade a lot of places where it wasn't before. We saw it first. It's
eating the world in some sense, I think.
It is eating the world. We got emails, especially at the Fifth Column, but also at Reason. There's a hockey stick effect since June, since the George Floyd protests, and then the subsequent kind of purity spirals of firings at media institutions and cultural institutions everywhere. And people are saying, I've heard you guys talk about this for a long time, but my God, it's happening to me in the Navy, or it's happening to me in the human resources department of my software company, or here, or all these places where they did not expect to be sitting around having discussion groups about white fragility and being told what they can and can't say about various things. It's beginning to happen elsewhere. So that middle ground, which is not necessarily an ideological middle ground, I think of it more as a temperamental middle ground, is a tough place to stand these days. It's wobbly. No one hates someone who's a temperamental centrist more than those who otherwise agree with him. Think about what's happening to Matt Taibbi right now.
Right.
Matt Taibbi signed the Harper's letter, or he didn't sign it actually. He just wrote about it and talked about it, but affiliated with it, the Harper's letter talking about the necessity to defend free speech in this very weird time. And right now, he's being excommunicated, or at least they're trying to excommunicate him in huge, broad swaths of the progressive left because he is ideologically adjacent yet disagrees with him on this fundamental thing, and they cannot abide it. So there's all this kind of unfriendly fire that comes from people there. So it's a tough place to stand. But for me, I'm used to being lonely, and I'm used to enjoying that kind of constant attempt to judge things on a case-by-case, kind of individualistic, liberal, for lack of a better word, basis, even when everyone seems to be losing their damn fool minds.
Yeah. For the new listeners of the podcast, I had on Katie Herzog, who was one of the signers of the letter that Matt mentioned there. I want to get back to what you said about learning as we learn. One of the things I've been thinking about recently is whether the phenomenon of not having a working feedback loop in society is a new one, or of not being able to properly integrate new data. And I can see the case for that being the case or against it. I think about ways in which we get into a war, and then even when it looks like the war is not a good idea, we stay in the war. That's a very long-term phenomenon in the States for sure. But then there seems to be something particular about right now with the data, for example, about COVID, that it's now somewhere between 10 and 100 times less deadly than was originally predicted. But the measures that are proposed for combating it haven't changed. So the reaction was sold on data that was way up here. The reality came in way down here, but there was no change to accommodate that new data in terms of thinking about policy. I wonder if that's unique to this moment or a growing trend, or you think that our kind of societal feedback loop for new information and data has always been broken and we're just seeing it more right now?
I don't know. It's an interesting question. Certainly, I notice, and it's part of the joy of living in New York, when the Love Gov, Andrew Cuomo, was giving press conferences every single day, and he would just sort of say there, we're just following the data, the science. That's all we're doing, just that follow the data. I would say it over and over again. I wanted to throttle him. Not that it's a bad idea to follow the data. I think it's a great idea to follow the data and the science, but stop the pretense that that's what you were doing. Because I'm sure data and science are, and first of all, it's treating science as a red button or an on-off switch. That's not science. Science is an ever-evolving discovery process. People misuse that concept constantly. But also, he's just making political calculations or policy guesses and dressing it up in the clothes of some kind of exalted brain think. Yesterday, I think it was, he was out there saying, let's be clear. You can go to restaurants, but you can't go to bars. You can sit outside and eat, but you can't sit outside and drink. Are we following the science still? Or are we trying to change behavior that we are worried about because we have this kind of gut sense that if we see a bunch of young kids outside drinking that they're going to lose their inhibitions and that's somehow bad? People are not very honest about what they're doing. One problem that we have that might get closer to answering your question is that the mediating institutions, like almost every institution in certainly this country and perhaps all over the kind of Western world, they are withering, they're suffering their own nervous breakdowns. They are losing their ability to speak with a level of authority and believability. It's not that I want, the newspaper to tell me what life is, but I want to trust it more than I do right now. And there is, within the journalism industry in particular, a couple of twin things happening. One is that they're just suffering an ongoing kind of economic industrial collapse, or just, very strong economic difficulties that they were not very well adapted for a variety of reasons. One of which is that they were, basically printing money for almost a half a century. They're making 25% profit margins, and you don't get nimble and innovative when you feel like you're running a monopoly. So that's happening, but also within the way that the industry conceives itself, there's this flight from a sort of myth of sense of fairness to that now we need to go and find, what in the words of Wes Lowery is a moral clarity. So that's the new objectivity, is us having a moral imperative to what we're talking about. So basically it's going to be much more about eating your Wheaties. So if you are taking Wheatie recipes from the New York Times, you're not, or whatever, newspaper or, mediating institution that before had some level of authority, when you know and can see and feel, and especially when it affects something that you have particular intimate knowledge of, that now they're doing it from a sense of like lecturing you, you stop believing them. So where do you go? We get these kinds of feedbacks and emails constantly, again, both at Reason and at the Fifth Column, of people saying, I can no longer trust fill in the blank, usually newspapers or magazines or whatever. I trust you guys doing this podcast or doing this magazine, but how do can we build something like big? Can we build a replacement thing? I'll give you one silly example that's come up a lot in conversation, both online and in meet space, of the goings on in Portland. You get all these little snippets of video of violent clashes between people, and like the spectacularly is that Navy guy who just went up to a bunch of feds and got like sprayed in the face and hit, and he didn't even flinch. It was pretty amazing. But you get all these contextless 15-second video snips, don't get a lot of good reporting, and you're like, gosh, I really wish that there was some reporters on the ground who I could trust. I was having this very conversation with my good friend and comrade, Nancy Robelman, who has lived in Portland for most of the last 10, 15 years. And we were sitting here in New York talking about it on a Saturday and realized, well, she better go back to Portland and do the reporting because, people trust Nancy Robelman content. But it's amazing. 15 years ago, I would have trusted the Oregonian. I would have trusted the Willamette Week. I would have trusted certain journalists who I knew on the ground there, and et cetera. I might have trusted the LA Times flying someone up or the New York Times flying someone out. And now, like, kind of all that is gone. You have this preponderance, and it's a great thing, of citizen video and, on the ground type of amateur
reporting and whatnot.
And that's great. But you also need some kind of trustworthy mediating institutions. And we haven't seen, I don't think, a recreation of that. And so it's a constant level of scrambling around and discovery for this. I think it's a great opportunity for new institutions to be built, but we're still in the phase where they need to be built or they need to form. And in that moment, it becomes difficult to have productive policy conversations, particularly since everyone really wants to have the sort of mental relaxation of saying, wait a second, so you're Antifa, I hate you. You're the Proud Boys, I hate you. Okay, I can stop thinking about it.
Right. I think that right now we do have a situation where, at least from my perspective, the voices I trust the most to report facts are the ones outside of the establishment press, the independent voices, Tim Pools and whatnot, and Matt Taibbi's and so forth, the people who are not tethered directly to one of the existing institutions. One of the things that, as you're talking there, thinking about is a comment by a writer. Unfortunately, I've forgotten the name, but he talked about how institutions have become more performative than formative. That it used to be that colleges and institutions that were journalistic institutions and whatnot were highly focused on the formation of citizens and good citizens in some sense, or the formation of good journalists. But at this point, it seems like institutions are more interested in performing, and that, I think, goes along with performing a particular kind of bias or, as you said, moral clarity about an issue.
I think that there's a lot to that. If you look at the resignation letter of Barry Weiss from the New York Times, and you can hate Barry Weiss. I know a lot of people that do. I know her personally. She's actually a sweet individual human being, regardless of the things that I disagree with her politically. She has a paragraph about that her contention, and is slightly hyperbolic but interesting, is that it's no longer editors editing the New York Times, it's Twitter. On Twitter, that's where the staffers of the New York Times, instead of engaging in journalism, are engaging in performative expression. And this also happens internally on Slack. Occasionally their Slack channels then get republished in the Huffington Post and elsewhere. And so people are kind of like it's a one-upsmanship publicly, and it's very performative. And you think about it like, it's a weird approach to journalism. journalism is supposed to be kind of a built-in humility to the project of like, I don't know this topic. I am learning about this topic. I am sharing my learning with people who might disagree with me about this topic, but hopefully in a way that is useful to help organize their own thinking and to advance knowledge. That's what I understood journalism to always be, something like that. Give an example. This might sound a bit esoteric, but so I and some friends from college newspaper started a newspaper in Prague, then Czechoslovakia, in 1991. We were all a bunch of 22-year-old hippies. We didn't speak Czech, although some of our co-founders and obviously comrades did. You know, talk about filter. Holy cow. Like, okay, so we don't know anything about the history of this country. We just happen to be living here because beer's super cheap and communism collapsed and we were all curious and wow, this is a great city. But we also want to know what's going on and we want to share that knowledge and to explore things. And so one way that we thought about things is to, let's not ever write a story about a person without showing a big photograph of that person. For a newspaper that had none of the founders were photographers, we had some of the best photography I've seen of any publication because we shared that ethic. We wanted to show people. We wanted to, like, if we're telling the stories of people, do not talk in abstract terms about market transitions and, coupon privatization. Yes, talk about those things, but talk about how are things affecting people on the individual level that keeps you rooted in a certain humanity. And let's not have first person. It wasn't a strict rule, but particularly in the news pages and the culture pages, we strove for writing only in the third person because, like, who the hell are we? What do we know? Show our ignorance on our sleeve in a good faith effort to try to understand stuff. Bring our weirdo perspective, which is going to be different, and hopefully allow for certain types of journalisms that were not possible before, just because we are headstrong 22-year-olds with a different background than other people. But also, like, don't make it about us. There was a funny thing that went around the interwebs a couple of days ago. I think it was on a site called The Fence, where they interviewed the New York Times correspondent of the New York Times. It's like, you've had a really busy week. Oh, I love my job. We're just always talking about what people at the New York Times are talking about, and this is very important. There's a sense of first person singular and first person plural that is very performative. That is like, look at me, look at me, look at me.
The news is the news kind of thing happening.
The news is the news, and we are engaged in historical important struggle within these pages. It's super narcissistic and myopic, and to think that there's a huge audience for that, I think, is wrong. I think there's still a basic market need everywhere in the world for people to have information that they think is at least somewhat reliable and trustworthy. And so those consumers, that audience, is scrambling around, flailing to find anyone they can trust. They find, as you say, individual proprietors increasingly, or, kind of alternative publications, a lot of podcasts, because that affects people in a different kind of way. But it's decreasingly these legacy media institutions, and boy, that's some kind of opportunity out there. I think it's at this moment, it's not particularly great for or maybe it's just sort of reflective of the pathologies that we're experiencing in governance and in politics and in culture, and they're bad pathologies, and I think they're going to be with us for a while. But also, I think there are opportunities to create better things going forward.
I think one of the things that confused me the most as we moved into the reaction to the pandemic was how much the legacy media or the mass media still had such a strong pull in terms of moving people in a particular direction. I think the panic came from the mass media. It wasn't so much from the more niche areas that I was listening to in terms of panic or whatever. There was lots of discussion about the facts surrounding the virus, but there wasn't from those quarters a lot of necessarily panic or call for shut it all down now. And it seems to me that both with the lockdowns and then before that with the major stories that have been bouncing around for the past 4 or 5 years, like the Russian collusion thing and whatnot, that that no matter what's happening on the margins in terms of what people are saying in these independent media sites, no matter how many people are listening to the Joe Rogan podcast, the agenda and the mass, for lack of a better word, hysteria is still driven, it seems, very much by these mainstream outlets. Do you think that's the case, or do you think that it has changed and that there is now more power rooted in these alternative outlets to dominate the conversation?
I would put it somewhat differently. I think that two things in particular conspired to create a distortionate national response to this. The two biggest factors are not necessarily kind of the power of existing media, although we'll get to that in a bit, but are one, that 140,000 people, that's a lot of people dying. It's big. It's sort of once a century type of thing from a sickness. I think maybe we had one flu that came close to it. Or
yeah, just to put, for my listeners anyway, an asterisk on that, I think the data is just absolutely horrible surrounding it. It's clear a lot of people have died from it. It's clear a lot of people have died with it too. And I dug into some of that, and it's it's absolutely abysmal, the data surrounding it. A lot of people have died from it or with it.
A lot of people have died, and I think here's the important thing, and it gets back to your frame of filtering, is that a lot of people died, especially in this tiny little provincial capital known as New York City, where a disproportionate amount, a lopsided amount of media lives in. And there's a fascinating piece by Jack Schaefer and somebody else in Politico about 2 years ago that talked about something that was surprising and against what you might think intuitively, what I might think intuitively, which is that the way that digital media had been created, and this is now kind of in the wave that included Vox, and you might include BuzzFeed and different things like that. So the stuff the Gawker Empire created, that plus existing newspapers and kind of even TV affiliates in local markets shrinking, made the total share of journalists who basically live in New York went from, and I'm going to botch the numbers, but it's essentially some proportion like this, from 1/3 to 1/2. Like, it was a huge shift in just 10 years, the geographical concentration of journalism in New York, in a place that already was a media capital because it already had a competitive environment, and it's where most of the cable news is located and such. And so what does that do to the way that we look at the world? I think that when the history of the pandemic and the responses, when the histories are written, there's going to be some amount paid attention to this, because New York and California started getting reports of people infected and dying at around the same time, in February-ish. New York, actually, from my point of view, was a little bit late, as I was mentioning before, in responding to it. The graph started going off the charts. That dominates the national discussion. People start treating what's happening in Southern California, where I'm from originally, as being very similar to what's happening in Northeast, in New Jersey, New York, and Connecticut, in the tri-state area. And it just isn't. It just isn't at all. And so, Gavin Newsom is having just as stringent, if not more stringent, lockdowns at a time when California has cases at a microscopic percentage of what was happening in New York. They're pulling people off skimboards in Malibu. Get out of the ocean. Like, what? There is no science for which that would possibly make sense, even during the midst of a pandemic that was raging. And it wasn't at the time in Southern California. And so I think that is a catastrophic policy mistake, because if you even grant, for sake of argument, that at the height of the badness, you need to have an authoritarian response. All right, let's pretend that we all agree that that's the case. I don't necessarily, and I know you don't, but let's pretend that's the case. When do you do it? And for how long can people put up with it? What we're going to find in places, and I think that they're sort of discovering this in the Sun Belt right now, is that if you lock people down for 3 months and then tell them, oh yeah, now we really have to lock down because we finally have a pandemic here. The numbers are finally starting to trend badly. What are they? They're not going to pay attention to you. They are going to be that little snake in a can ready to burst out and go crazy because humans are not hamsters. We are not built to do this. It is so unnatural. It is so unnatural to be penned in and hemmed in and unable to do your basic things, unable to make your own decisions and your own choices of how you best process information. It's crazy. And I think the New York centricity of media really built that in. And so right now, New York doesn't have much of a pandemic. We're getting almost back to normal, although the politicians are doing everything in their power to make sure that never really happens too. But it's like too late. So everyone kind of built in the national media response, like, oh my God, the president needs to do something, needs to, mandate masks, needs to whatever. And the thing is, the country just isn't New York. You have to adapt on a local, on a state case-by-case basis. Even the lethality, the science of the virus itself is different in different places. And so in that sense, I think more so necessarily than just sort of like the media creates the marching orders that everyone pays attention to. I think that distorted our field of vision, and it's going to continue having negative effects in the fall and afterwards.
So it's New York and not necessarily the power of the media.
Always blame New York.
Always blame New York. So one of the things you just mentioned there towards the end that I want to pick up on is the idea that you could have these people saying, well, we'll lock down for 3 months and then we'll do it again or whatever, without really thinking about what the consequences are going to be. I think one of the consequences is the extent to which we've seen violent looting and rioting and protesting, that it was an unexpected, but in retrospect, obvious thing that you would have some form of breaking out at the end of this, in which people who have been socially isolated, locked in their rooms, removed from their jobs, given free money, and are young people are going to kind of go a little bit nuts. But I want to even broaden that out. And it seems to me, and again, maybe this is just a hypersensitivity to the particular moment, but I feel like we're at a time when institutions seem to believe that consequences don't exist, and a reaction to what you're doing isn't necessarily going to happen. And that is the case for sure with the lockdowns. It's also the case with things like the national debt, where right now spending levels are off the chart. And there's no, either because, again, getting back to that idea of the myopathy of the moment, or for some other reason, and not just with that, but with other things too, it seems to me that there are a lot of things being done that are extreme without any thought to what the consequences are going to be, or with the belief that either those will be sorted out later, or they don't matter, or for some reason we don't even have to think about them.
Yeah, I think there's a constant problem or pathology going back decades in journalism and politics, which is that, literally decades and decades and decades, which is that people don't follow up on the initial rosy glow of the motivations behind a law or government action or change and its actual effects thereof. The consequences of it. There was an entire strain of journalism and politics that arose in the late 60s and early 70s, very influential on me in my formation in both journalism and politics. And it was within the left. It was kind of centered at the Washington Monthly magazine, which was founded by a guy named Charlie Peters, who had been involved in the formation of the Peace Corps. And he had the insight in the late 60s of like, you know what? We have to look at consequences of these things. The motivations are not nearly enough. And we have to admit that the consequences of many of our policies that we thought were so beautiful and pretty, when applied through a bureaucracy, produced perverse results that were against the nature of it. And so we need to document the mistake, see what the connection was, and learn from it for next time. So it was sort of a internal government skeptical way of looking at things from the left. Always made a lot of sense to me. So we've very much lost that, the kind of contrarian left view of actually consequences matter too, dude. And in that kind of binary sorting exercise that I was talking about before, it's never about that. There's a talk about it, a journalist who's in the middle of the zeitgeist right now, Nicole Hannah-Jones from the New York Times, fundamental to the 1619 Project, which reimagines American history as being rooted not in the Declaration of Independence and this wonderful liberty document, but rather in the institution of slavery that began the first slave ship or something in 1619. Anyways, she wrote a piece for the New York Times Magazine about 1 year ago about busing, about the history of busing. And it's a very good piece, very well documented. But the kicker was busing didn't fail. Talking about the 1970s, forced school busing to integrate schools. Busing didn't fail. We failed. Think about that formulation. It's tremendous. It is saying that it doesn't matter the negative consequences. Our motives were good and pure and right. We were being anti-racist. The fact that it didn't adhere just meant that we ourselves were not strong enough to make the obvious good thing happen. That's where we are at in so much of policy. And I think about this a lot in terms of education policy in New York, because I have two daughters in the public school system, at least for the microsecond. We'll see about what happens in the fall, because they're engaged in a long discussion about equity and systems of white supremacy and standardized tests and this and admissions and whatnot. And everything is freighted in the language of racism. For instance, my 5-year-old, who's going into kindergarten, might be able to go to school only 1 day a week in the fall, even though 5-year-olds are not catching or transmitting the disease. It's terrible, but so what parents are doing, or what you would expect, is that they're creating what they're calling pods, which is, let's get 4 other families, and each family has 1 day where they'll take the 5 kids and create their own little education thing, either hire a tutor or have a mom or dad sit them through their day. So, how does the New York Times respond? The opinion page yesterday, are pods racist? And that detachment of consequence and looking at consequences through policymaking is with us. And it's been with us for a long time. I wrote a cover story for Reason back in 2016 during the election, when it but then had become a contest between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. And the piece was called Debt Denialists, to get back on your debt message, which is basically even the rhetorical acknowledgments from both major parties that you can't just keep doing this long-term fiscal picture with the entitlements stuff coming due, and you can't just keep running up trillion-dollar deficits every year. That's just unsustainable. That rhetorical observation, and I do believe it's an observation, and it's one that's underlined by everything that's produced by the Congressional Budget Office and other kind of semi-autonomous econometric institutions, that vanished in around 2014. So my favorite weird junk stat of that is that every single State of the Union address from 1997 to 2013, regardless of the president, included some we're going to have to fix entitlements long term so that we can, keep our seniors well, and we have to, we can't keep racking up this amount of debt. Every single one did until then. None of them have since. Donald Trump ran explicitly against Paul Ryan's concept of entitlement reform and is mocking it as garbage. Meanwhile, as Bernie Sanders' ideas gained sway, they, on the left, they developed an entire great junk science called modern monetary theory, which can be summed up as it just doesn't matter long term. So people are completely divorced from it. So now it is just are you on the good team? Does the good team want to do the good thing? Or are you on the bad team and the bad team wants to do the bad thing? People are not connecting the actual results. And what's fascinating, when you do connect the actual results, let's say on school integration things, which again is what I'm paying attention to, the guy who runs the New York City school system, who's awful, named Richard Carranza, ran the San Francisco one before it. And actually, the New York Times had a very good piece about this, obviously, because it was not written by their terrible education reporter, that analyzed San Francisco's radical attempts to integrate or desegregate their schools in their language, which I think is already a misuse of language. And what happened is that they started telling parents that you have to go 45 minutes to go drop your kid off at this school over here. And parents said no, and the racial makeup of schools actually got worse as a result. So the thing that they did for their great noble reason, measured on that great noble reason, failed. Perhaps Nicole Hannah-Jones would say that's because we failed. But it's no, you actually have to design systems based on what's going to work and measure them against the results that they were that they were talking about. And that's true of war, that's true of debt, it's true about big social programs. There's a consequence-freeness to where we are. And that's normal for populism. And we're seeing a rise in populism domestically and internationally, right populism and left populism at the same time. They're becoming mirror images of one another. And populists ain't got no time to like sit around and hear about your fancy lad, how did it work out type of math. That's just not where they're at.
Right. The consequences in other places who've tried this, who cares? And I see that as a rise in a focus on moralism as opposed to consequences.
Yeah.
And being more concerned, I guess that goes back to the performative aspect of we're performing the act of doing the right thing. And it doesn't matter whether the consequences of that work out or not. And if they don't, then that's a function of the failure of others and not the failure of us. We did the right thing. They failed to do the right thing. Of course, this has to, I imagine, bring up in a lot of people's minds the idea of communism, which is touted over and over again as a wonderful ideal. And then when it fell short, it was because human beings were not good enough to live up to the standards of it. But I want to continue along with that and talk about the ways in which what you're saying really gets at a fight towards how we perceive the world. And again, this might be something that has always been there. I'm sure it's something that's always been there, but it seems like in the last few years, we have amped up the war on how you get to perceive things. So, our pod's racist. That's how they have to be perceived. And the war has become very explicit in the sense that you have institutions that are very directly saying not just here's the evidence that this is that, but you must perceive this in this way. And that's an ideological purity thing much more than evidence or data thing from my perspective anyway. And because there's this heightened focus on perception, I think that the war over culture has become a war over language and a need to make language and terms like that, like racist, flexible enough to encompass anything you want to stuff in there and smear. So it has to, it has to retain its stigma because that's important ideologically for the people who are using that label. But then we also need it to be broad enough that we can throw anything and anything we don't like or disapprove of in there. So the culture wars or the political wars, even to some extent, seem to have been driven to the level of language.
Yeah, very much. I mean, if you look at the way people on the left criticize the New York Times or other institutions of journalism, what are they getting excited about when you encounter them doing that more often than not? It is when it's their use of adjectives in a tweet. It's like the president shifted his tone on Wednesday. Hate that. And there is a critique to that, which is like, don't bet on the president keeping any tone shift for longer than it takes him to belch. But also they want to explicitly call the president a liar and a racist as much as they possibly can. If only we can start telling those truths in the most harsh, permissible language, then something's going to happen. That's what I fail to understand. Like the next step, the level of policing on that is crazy. It's just like nonstop adjective wars. The language that I see that is maybe most pernicious in this is the way that racism has been sort of racism creep. And I can't stress enough how much this isn't me complaining that white people can't use the N-word or God knows what. It is that to talk about and participate in the formation of education policy in a city like New York, for example, but increasingly everywhere else. And I wrote a long feature about this in Reason just last September, and part of my kicker was like, hey, you know what? I know this sounds crazy to all you out there, but this tactic is coming near you. Normal conversation and activity is going to be branded as racist on purpose by people seeking power and seeking to change policy. And they're doing this specifically not to an audience that you would normally perceive as racist. They're doing this specifically to cow progressives who would like shudder at the thought of being called racist. I didn't realize when I wrote this, which again is like maybe last October that the whole country would be doing it within 9 months. But the whole country's kind of doing it right now. But it's the expansion of and the kind of collapse of racism, inequity, and systemic racism and white supremacy into one kind of ball of things, so that wherever there is an unequal outcome based on racial classifications, and let's be clear, racial classifications are pretty junk science that largely was created by racists. But anyways, wherever we see disproportionate impacts or success or failure rates, whether they're in schools or whether they're in participation rates in this profession or this academic specialty or whatever, that in itself, if it's disproportionately bad, particularly for black and brown people, as opposed to Asians who are white adjacent sometimes, it's a terrible, pernicious concept, then that is an example of systemic racism. And if it's systemic racism, you can at some point take out the word systemic and just call it racism. And you could sort of conflate that with white supremacy because it's the institution of white supremacy. And it all kind of bleeds. And before you know it, very normal people in very normal settings who think of themselves as hating racism are accused in public settings of being a racist, which discourages their participation. And it's my argument that participation is discouraged on purpose. And that's what moved me to write about this in the first place, because I saw all of these people who, unlike me, have not been speaking in public and writing in public for 34 years. I'm used to being criticized for whatever. And I'm also used to choosing my words carefully in such a way that it's pretty hard to come at me, generally speaking. And I'm too old. I don't really care anymore. But other people who work in different places, they show up and they are terrified to talk, because what is the worst thing that you can be called in the American culture right now and most of the time is a racist, right? A guy at one meeting that I was at, Scandinavian of some sort, I think he was Swedish. We have a lot of international people in our school district here in Brooklyn. It's Brooklyn. It's kind of an international place. And they were talking about a pretty radical overhaul in the admissions standards, where they got rid of all of admissions criteria, including like you no longer have to show that you can be good at performing arts to get into the performing arts middle school. That's what I'm talking. Like, just remove all admissions criteria and try to replace it with as much permissible kind of racial and economic balancing out as possible. That's in a nutshell. It's more complicated than that, but that's kind of where they're at. And there's a public meeting talking about this, the first kind of response to the initial results of the system as it had been put into place. And this guy, so you rank all the schools that you want your kids to go to in order of your preference, and then it goes through a little beep boop machine and they spit out a designation for you. He put 9 schools up for his kid and he got none of them. And they put him to a school far away that he didn't necessarily want to go to. But he prefaced his question at a public meeting like this. He said, "I totally support what you're doing and these changes because it's really important to fight racism. I didn't get the school that we wanted for our kid, but we're going to go there anyways in the fall. But my question to you, leadership of the school system here, is what are you going to do to reach out to parents who have had similar experiences like mine, only they might be less supportive of the overall goal? How are you going to retain disaffected parents and not have an exodus from the schools?" Pretty normal question. It's actually an important question.
With a lot of the now requisite I'm a good guy throat clearing that has to go before you advocate rationally for your own case.
Absolutely. And one of the people up there in the Community Education Council, shaking with rage, said, I can't believe that I'm sitting here listening to someone asking, what am I going to do to reach out to racist parents? And the guy's like, what? And then, he's sputtering. And then someone else comes in here and says, look, you can move. You're rich enough to move. You can go upstate. But, our other parents of color don't have that option. They just started hurling accusations of racism at a guy in public, a guy who's not used to speaking in public. He's Scandinavian, so he's fluent in English, but it's not his country, not his place. I wrote about this, and I didn't talk to him in particular, but he caught wind of my reporting on this and got a hold of me. And what happened? His family moved out of New York State he said, this was such a jarring experience at that meeting to sit there with people who I thought were my allies in changing a school system that I was participating in, and to be called a racist was so upsetting to me and my family that we physically moved. To which there's a lot of people who will say, mission accomplished. But that's awful. You are using this scarlet letter to discourage actively public participation among people who are your ideological adjacents in order to push through your perceived thing. I am not here for that. I'm here for the opposite of that. So it begins with the presentation of language. The very first slideshow before they were trying to sell this change to an audience full of people a couple years back. Park Slope, right? Like super lefty area. They showed a slideshow and it was like Brown versus Board of Education and fire hoses and stuff like that, talking about changing a Brooklyn school system. It's like, you know what? This isn't Little Rock, 1954. This is literally Brooklyn in 2018, 2019, 2020. My contention is that conflation of language to talk about policy in terms of segregation and desegregation when it's no longer state mandates of racial classifications, and it isn't that anymore, is we probably should have been fighting those linguistic battles before. But now that it's on us, I think that those people are in for some kind of backlash or backstop. At some point, people are going to say, oh, "Hold on, this is crazy. You can't keep doing it."
I keep waiting for that, but I don't know that it's happened in any major way. Even, and maybe we're beginning to see this as some of the kind of my pronouns madness is melting away a little bit, but we're still left with a place in which the level of flexibility that people are allowed to have with words, if they are expressing themselves in a way where they get to feel like they're on that moral good guy side or on the side that gets to actively badger people who are on the bad guy side, is still astonishing. You have still companies that are pandering to the idea that men can get cervical cancer. Or there was a person for some kind of version of the Diva Cup, and they had in their ad a trans woman. And that's maybe not language exactly, but it's the idea that you've got a certain amount of fluidity in your perception of reality, and that certainly blends into the language that you use. And within that flexibility and fluidity, you can drive through any particular agenda you want, and you can create any kind of a weird trap that allows you to catch anyone who doesn't use their language in just the right way, so that in effect you've created a situation where no amount of throat clearing is going to even work unless you get to the point where you are saying, a man is a woman, 2 + 2 = 5 or whatever. You saw that with the Harper's letter, which spent a long period of time at the beginning doing the, we're going to say all the right things, and then still got blasted anyway, which was to be expected. But I'm still looking for that pushback against people who want to use language in a completely flexible way solely for political agenda purposes.
Yeah, and I'm also increasingly of the minds, and this could be the pernicious effects of hanging around too much with Camille Foster, who's very ornery and does not like to be classified in any way, shape, or form that you might otherwise classify him as. But I don't care. I don't. People's attempts to police language to have you pretend that it is a common word to say, like BIPOC or Latinx or however you pronounce that. I'm too old to learn a lot of new jargon, and at some point, reminds me actually of subculture I've long been part of, which is kind of baseball stat nerd stuff, post Bill James online culture. And there was a period of time there before that culture, took over the management of a lot of baseball organizations, when every new created stat or formula, the whole point of it was to have the weirdest possible name. So there was VORP, value over replacement player. They just did it because they wanted to say VORP a lot. there is a projection system that I think was started by Nate Silver, if I'm not mistaken, called, I forget what the acronym is, but it's spelled out PECOTA, PECOTA, which is itself a somewhat weird name, but it's actually the name of like a really terrible backup shortstop from the Kansas City Royals from the 1990s, and like just trying to be funny. There's a lot of that, and I see that in the way that people are using terminology and language right now. And have fun, but I'm not so interested. I'm right now like expressly anti-throat clear. Like if you wanna come at me, good luck. My record's in public, baby. Go pour through the archives. You can look up my college newspaper if you want. I stand by that work, stand by all the work that I've done. And I don't need to demonstrate to you. Like there's this stupid thing over the weekend where a guy who's apparently a senator from Hawaii named Brian Schatz, I'd never heard of him, shouldn't admit that, but it's true. He's like, where are libertarians talking about Portland? Like the libertarians should be all over this. And the implication was that they were silent. And because libertarians are stupid, they spent the weekend saying, we're not silent. We really don't like the federalization of police, blah, blah, and like sort of demonstrating the bona fides. And my increasing reaction is like, I'm not responsible for your reading incomprehension. I am not here to correct your errors, your bad faith errors. You can easily find things that I write under my name, things my publications write, and things we say on the podcast. They're right there for you. I'm not going to bait you into making me throat clear that I'm a good guy. Presume I'm a bad guy. I don't give a crap. But if you're going to come at me directly, you are going to lose. So good luck. Camille has a phrase which I identify with. I mean, maybe it's a little bit more hardcore than I do, but I think it's worth thinking about in the age of 2020, which is be brave, call bullshit. You don't have to agree to these terms, these terminologies. You don't have to like ritually clear your throat and assure them that you're on the good team. Maybe you're on the bad team. Maybe holding that as a possibility is can give you some power. At any rate, for me, it's just a waste of brain space to care about it. I've got stuff I need to do. I need to do some journalism. I don't need to be hung up on other people's bad faith misapprehensions of what I've been doing.
I want to go back to your analogy of the two rivers going in different directions and the eroding bank in the middle, and maybe see if we can't rescue some piece of optimism here from this. I think that it's always the case that, that when a party has someone elected, the people who were the big supporters of that person have their moment where they think that everything is going to change. And then they have their moment where they realize that maybe not so much is going to change. And I'm wondering if there's some hope here in this moment. I'm seeing anyway some people who have been fairly strong partisans and have been very much swept down one of those two rivers, if you want to use that analogy. Notice that even when they were in power or had power over particular places, or their guy got in power, that it didn't work. So I see this right now among supporters of Trump who are waking up to the idea that he didn't actually win, that he won, but he didn't win. And that right now he seems to be losing and he seems to be giving up on his stated goals. And I saw a lot of people in the primaries after the second time that Bernie got routed under somewhat dubious circumstances come to the conclusion that maybe this partisan way of going and this, we're going to get this done by being hardcore team blue or hardcore team red, isn't a workable strategy. And we need to look for either third party stuff or just reevaluate the stream in which we're getting swept up in. And the core, I think what would be the core fundamental belief right now in each of those two strong currents, which is that the absolute thing that we must do because the fate of the universe depends on it is get our guy elected and throw out the other guy, or vice versa, right? Do you see any signs that people are beginning to walk back from that rigid form of thinking?
Not really. as someone from Southern California, I've congenitally optimistic about things. And that optimism switched sometime in 2016, probably coinciding with Trump winning the Republican nomination, which is something I didn't think that was going to happen. Not that many of the other competitors were anything to write home about. But to see that existing institutions were so weak and so susceptible to takeover, but also that the way that consumers were consuming politics and expressing themselves politically was based so much on their sense of personal agitation, way more necessarily than specific policy impulses or ideological sortings, that we are going to be in a populist moment for a while. And even though Bernie lost twice, and you're right, Bernieism has gained, and it's morphing, it's taken its own shape, it's now the Squad, it's AOC, there's this unrequited desire. And that's still where all the juice is, the excitement is in the Democratic Party, even if it ultimately loses when it comes time to nominating a president. Probably the best case for the rosy scenario is actually, and this is weird for me to say this because I've not liked him for 50 years, is the victory of Joe Biden in the Democratic primary. Not because Joe Biden's any good, but because everybody else ran at him, for the most part, trying to out-woke one another. Or, in Bernie and Elizabeth Warren's case, just go super lefty on economics. And essentially, and this is a crude reduction, the most conservative part of the electorate in the Democratic Party, which are black voters, said, nah, we need to win. that stuff ain't popular. So they tried wokeism, and it really crashed and burned every single person. And some of these candidates were, their histories were way more interesting than being a kind of language scold and someone competing in a race to call everybody a racist. People like Beto O'Rourke has an interesting track record. They ditched all that stuff, tried to outwoke one another, and everybody who did face planted. So maybe the retreat to Biden, this is fumbling old half with it, a career politician, is a sign that there is some sense of limitation. However, I think what that's just going to do is feed the urgency of the kind of AOC wing of the Democratic Party. They want to effect their takeover. They'll try to take over Biden while he's in office. There is less, not more, sense of trying to herd people into binaries. You mentioned third parties. Third parties are going to get absolutely wiped out this election, as they were in the 2018 midterm, is when people are so excited about negative polarization, they don't have a lot of time or sympathy for independents or third-party candidates. I mean, Kanye West is a very popular entertainer, if a bit crazy around the edges. The only poll I've seen him in, he was polling at 2%. You'd think a famous person could get at least 5%. But no, there's no time or tolerance for that, because damn it, this is the most important Flight 93 election of our lifetimes. So I think it's going to take a while to work that stuff out. And let's not forget, not only do we have a pandemic here, but we also have economic crisis. That's just enormous. We racked up more debt in the month of June than we had most years during the Obama administration. And there were pretty high debts or deficits in the Obama administration. It's crazy. We're going to have double-digit employment for a couple of years at least. We're writing checks no honest man can pay off. Think about how much the financial crisis spurred both the Tea Party movement and the Occupy Wall Street movement. This is bigger than the financial crisis. There are going to be effects, and there will be responses, and I think it's going to cause a lot of populists. Yes, there'll be some who's like, maybe we went too far. Let's retreat into normalcy. Let's go into other pursuits of life. But I think what it's going to do is kind of what happens to populists everywhere. They'll say, well, you didn't populist hard enough. Now we're going to try the true populism this time, and we're going to have, $35 minimum wage and everything else. So I'm a little bit pessimistic. I think that there is space to be had in the middle of those currents in the world of journalism and commentary and comedy and other things, because those two currents are not fun. They're awful places to be, and they produce on purpose individual cases of injustice, flouting for all sense of due process. And again, they're mirror images. There's a reason why Sohrab Ahmari is going after David French on the right, and why righties love Viktor Orban and want, post-liberal democracies. Just as there's a reason why there's a leftist response in horror and vitriol at free speech liberals. Like, go screw yourself. So I think it's going to be with us for a while. I wish it wasn't, but I also think that is an opportunity for those of us who write and talk and do journalism and commentary and entertainment in the center area, because we can even produce work that grudgingly can win, if not the respect, at least some attention by people who are otherwise being swept off into crazy land.
Certainly hope so. Matt, thanks for coming on The Filter.
Thank you so much, Matt. More Matts, always a good idea. And thank you for the very interesting conversation.
And I'd recommend people do check out the Fifth Column podcast. They also have a Patreon. I'm a subscriber to that, so
thank you.
Help support them.
Appreciate that.
Thanks for listening to The Filter with Matt Asher. You can find show notes at thefilter.org or follow user Matt Asher on the socials.